Around half of the United States now believes in a left-wing communist world conspiracy, and the other half believes in a right-wing fascist world conspiracy. You're supposed to pick one of those sides, you're supposed to hate the other side, and you're supposed to believe that the other side is constantly lying and scheming, and your own side is fighting for everything that's good. But the world is, of course, far more complex than this. So in the minds of the Trump supporters, the Chinese Communist President Xi Jinping is sitting in a chair right now in Beijing with a satisfied expression on his face like some eccentric James Bond villain, stroking a weird-looking cat and bursting into a cackle. In agreement with Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, he supposedly bought the US voting computer manufacturer Dominion and had his minions press the appropriate buttons on election night to falsify millions of votes for Biden. The spectre of a Red Dawn and full-blown communist revolution on American soil is looming. And like any good paranoia, it has somewhat of a serious core to it. The Democrats have actually drifted sharply to the left, and the Chinese have a full-blown dangerous espionage program in the United States. Voting machines had a terrible reputation after the George Bush fiasco 20 years ago. However, Jinping did not just brazenly buy the Dominion voting computers through the UBS bank, and Joe Biden could not generate millions of votes from thin air or lift them from Trump with a few keystrokes. Such interference by China would be lunacy and would have the most dangerous consequences, and it would uproot the carefully maintained balance between the superpowers. There are, of course, more subtle kinds of interferences. Joe Biden's career does not belong to Jinping, but to the long-established DuPont family, which had bought its way into both parties and acted like European aristocracy for a very long time. The first successful DuPont was buddies with Thomas Jefferson, and maybe that's the reason the right wing does not want to get into this topic, but rather want to focus on the Biden family business dealings with China. It's interesting to note that the DuPonts were featured as one of 13 leading families in the hilariously bad conspiracy book 13 Bloodlines of the Illuminati, which was promoted by figures such as Alex Jones, who later became a staunch Trump supporter. The Democrats and the left-wing media, meanwhile, believe Vladimir Putin was the one sitting in his chair in 2016, stroking a weird-looking cat and cackling about how he controlled Donald Trump and manipulated the presidential election. In the left-wing echo chamber, it all seems to make sense and line up. Trump loves the dictator Putin, sent his lawyers out to overturn a legitimate election result, and directed his followers to march on DC, just like Mussolini had once called for the fascist march on Rome. And this paranoia also has a real core. Trump actually had sympathy for the Putin regime. Trump has a real aversion to socialism. Trump would like to rule much more like an authoritarian. And some wealthy large US entrepreneurs would like to have a right-wing regime. Some Trump supporters flirt with fascism or at least authoritarianism, or they choose authoritarianism as a lesser evil in order to push back socialism. Russia might have indeed some dirt on the Donald. I mean, who doesn't at this point? But it would be geostrategical suicide to leak a porn tape from a Russian hotel room or to leak shady business dealings with Russian figures who seem like clones of the Donald. Trump, like his father, had been influenced by standard conspiracy literature from the Birch Society, as have many influential pro-Trump businessmen and media figures such as Alex Jones. The Russians have been echoing the same ideas for years, and so there is ideological alignment and good old interpersonal sympathy between these players. The Russians may be faking their belief in a communist world conspiracy, but the Americans who derived their worldview from the Birch Society seriously believe that every large conspiracy is a communist-led conspiracy. But the world and its history are much more complex than that. Socialism originally started as a collection of rebellious ideas during the days of old-school open aristocratic rule, where most people were farming serfs, just like during the ancient Roman Empire. The basic concept was topple the greedy aristocrats, take their possessions and their land, divide it up amongst the population, and then establish a system of bureaucrats who decide what to produce and who gets it. Naturally, the aristocracy reacted by banning these ideas and sending out snitches and agents to infiltrate and take over the movement. Britain was especially good at this, and the international nature of socialist ideas meant an international dimension of espionage. Socialism's less radical brother was the Enlightenment movement, and this was also thoroughly infiltrated. British intelligence was led by a network of interlocking aristocratic families surrounding the old Welfen line that goes back to at least the year 800. British agents were used in France, Germany, and other countries to support dissent and opposition against the French monarchy and certain German rulers. Germany at the time was not a singular, homogeneous empire, but consisted of many different, competing little kingdoms and principalities, some of which were already run by Welfen families. And for a long time, France and Britain battled each other with conspiracy literature. The French, who controlled the Catholic Vatican, depicted the British and their Freemasonry and their Protestant church as a bunch of Satan-worshipping occultists. Vice versa, the Brits portrayed any kind of conspiracy as an occult French, Masonic, and/or Jesuit plot. British intelligence had established the Bavarian Illuminati as a front group to support revolutionary movements in France to topple the French monarchy. Adam Weishaupt may have visited a Jesuit school, but his main associates were people close to the Welfen orbit. The Illuminati experienced a serious breach when the Bavarian police got hold of internal membership lists and other documents. Among the members were powerful German Welfen leaders who were closely related to the British throne, and it wasn't hard to guess the purpose of the Illuminati. And immediately, British intelligence launched a salvo of conspiracy books that became bestsellers and directed the blame solely at mysterious French Freemasons and Jesuits. John Robison, author of Proofs of a Conspiracy, painted Weishaupt as a misguided man who exaggerated his power and his plans. Most members of the Illuminati had supposedly entered the group with the best intentions in mind. Some members may have been evil agents of France and the Vatican, or simply dangerous German occultists and revolutionaries. Never does Robison investigate whether British intelligence may have been behind the Illuminati. Instead, he praises the British king and British Freemasonry, which would never occupy itself with occultism or revolutionary ideas. Then came Baruel with his 4-part volume of books, which essentially said the same thing and was targeted at a French language and Catholic audience. Then you had several German conspiracy authors from the Illuminati itself who penned conspiracy books. Yes, conspirators created the genre of modern conspiracy literature. The French monarchy fell and Britain moved over to the age of managed constitutional democracy and managed capitalism. The old aristocracy continued to rule but left the limelight and used its intelligence networks to run front groups such as political parties, large corporations, and banks. A few of the new oligarchs that were created were Jewish, and that was dictated by the reasoning of the intelligence services. The infamous Rothschild banking enterprise, for example, was the project of the Landgrave of Hessen-Kassel and established operations in Germany, Austria, France, and Britain. According to commonly believed anti-Semitic myths, Jews only cared about money and other Jews, not about any particular country, and therefore there was little suspicion in Europe that Rothschild banking was a front for British intelligence. For many centuries, European royalty and other aristocrats had brutally taxed Jews and refused to pay back loans from Jewish bankers. A Jewish banker was at the mercy of the aristocrats, not the other way around. There was nothing unusual or secret about the regular Rothschild business, even when they collected money from investors for a military conflict that Prussia or Britain or whomever wanted to wage. British intelligence intentionally muddied the waters by infusing new myths and falsehoods into the conspiracy literature. The aristocrats who had built the mighty British colonial empire were painted as naive fools who fell into debt to the satanic scheming Jews to finance a luxurious lifestyle. The Jews secretly plotted to topple the old ruling classes, destroy all classic values, and plunge the world into darkness. The Waterloo fairy tale was absolutely key. Nathan Rothschild was depicted as having a better intelligence service than the British Empire, and therefore he was the first to know that Napoleon had lost the battle. Nathan created the false impression at the British Stock Exchange that Napoleon had won. Then stocks started to fall, panic set in, and a fire sale so Nathan could buy up stocks on the cheap. Then the public and other traders realized that Britain had won, but it was too late. Nathan had scammed the market, made a fortune, and then took over the entire City of London banking district and the Bank of England for good measure. But none of this was true. But it became the central element in the Jewish world dominance myth. If Rothschild had even just scammed Britain and the old aristocracy a little bit, he would have been killed or arrested and sentenced. The mighty British Empire killed whoever was in its way, and we are supposed to believe that some small Jewish families managed to steal this empire unhindered and unmolested. Just like that. People who believe this have no idea how the world worked at the time. This myth was subsequently expanded to the United States. The first two American central banks, which were created by the leaders of the revolution, were misrepresented in conspiracy literature as Jewish-controlled banks. The satanic Jews, through simple banking and scheming, managed to take over the United States as well. From this day forth, every seriously bad thing in America was due to the Jewish world conspiracy. Greedy capitalist exploitation, Jews. The weakening of families and traditions, Jewish plot. Unpopular wars, Jews. British aristocratic intelligence was already all over the place in the German Reich, a patchwork state which was never really a proper union. Welfen aristocrats easily infiltrated right-wing circles and even created new right-wing organizations. Anti-Semitic conspiracy literature was heavily infused into the German and Austrian right-wing, and even found its way into Tsarist Russia. The Tsars were basically the same family as the British throne, to be precise, the interlocking lines of Hessen-Darmstadt and Schleswig-Holstein. Most people just remember the name Romanov. The hope was to copy the American and British model of controlled democracy and controlled capitalism in Russia. But the regular Russian aristocracy did not play ball, but wanted to continue the old Roman-style serfdom system for all eternity. The Tsars could not expect to successfully rule like this. Tsarist intelligence had been trained by the Brits and controlled the new socialist movements, but the situation was nevertheless dangerous. The Tsars, Britain, and the United States, who all had significant assets among the socialist movements, hatched a plan. Conduct a revolution in Russia under the guise of socialism. This would destroy the old regular Russian aristocracy and finally create a unified, centralized dictatorship in Russia. Most Romanovs simply left the country in ships and traveled to their relatives in places like Denmark. 4 Romanov counts were supposedly killed, but there are no credible bodies, and the last Tsar vanished into thin air with his family. Much later, the Soviet government claimed they were killed by communist troops under orders from Lenin, who didn't bother to have photos taken of the Tsar or written statements of guilt under duress or anything else. The bodies were not kept, no film camera or audio device was used, there was no show trial, just nothing. Even though the Soviets were the masters of propaganda and show trials. Decades later, the remains were magically found, they said, and identified via DNA. But international experts seriously doubted the validity of the results. One intentional or accidental contamination would have spoiled the remains. So the only tangible piece of evidence is worthless. And by the rules of any serious investigation, no body means no evidence that a murder has occurred at all. Most likely, the Tsar traveled to Denmark in disguise. The world at the time was stunned. How could a gaggle of communists put an end to over 1,000 years of traditional Russian rule? Where did the communists, or Bolsheviks as they were called, get their money from and their weapons from? Well, mostly from the US and Britain. To distract from this, the intelligence agencies circulated more conspiracy theories about Jewish plotters and conflated those ideas with the old writings from the Illuminati of Bavaria. Adam Weishaupt was retroactively misrepresented as an asset of the Jews, and therefore the French Revolution was also a Jewish plot. Russia was simply another one of those Jewish revolutions, and of course, a number of Bolshevik leaders and fighters had a Jewish background, so it all seemed plausible to the readers. Large corporations from the United States ominously sold an almost complete variety of modern technology to the Soviets. Fred Koch, whose sons became the infamous Koch brothers from Koch Industries, built the first 15 oil refineries there and launched the Soviet oil industry. American politicians and secret societies like Skull and Bones were also very helpful for the USSR. It didn't take long for some people to notice the sheer scale of this. But intelligence circles used their old bag of tricks and spread the claims that Jewish Illuminati agents in the United States were responsible. The Protocols of Zion were a hilariously bad forgery cobbled together by lazy people. Not only did the authors of the protocols plagiarize older texts, even completely unrelated material, they also didn't bother to include secret factual material that exposed real secrets. Usually a good forgery needs some juicy facts to seem plausible, new facts. But anybody who had regular conspiracy books on his shelf could have written the protocols. There isn't even a coherent structure to the protocols. Every single chapter is just the same repetitive rambling. Only because contemporary conspiracy literature portrayed the Russian Revolution and other events as Jewish plots did the protocols seem impressive, as if they predicted what would happen later. Anglo-American and Russian intelligence especially targeted Germany with this conspiracy material after World War I, in order to soften German anger towards the US and Britain. According to the conspiracy narrative, the war had been caused and led by Jews. Right-wing American industry titans and politicians, as well as British aristocracy, were portrayed as very unhappy about the war and as potential partners of the new fascist or national socialist movement in Germany. British intelligence had already penetrated Germany a long time ago through Welfen aristocrats and other means. And so it wasn't difficult to fool the Nazis into believing the United States would not interfere in Europe again, and that Britain's aristocracy wanted an alliance with Germany. Hitler subsequently decided to not invade Britain, but instead launch an idiotic attack against Soviet Russia, which he considered as the Slavic and Jewish cesspool of world communism. After World War II, the Anglo-Americans controlled the neo-Nazi movement as well as the more modern type of Cold War conspiracy media. Knowingly or unknowingly, best-selling authors like William Guy Carr based their books on the older manipulative works from Nesta Webster, John Robison, and guys like Baruel. The John Birch Society was established as a group to promote anti-communist literature, but became simply a multiplier of the old narratives. Donald Trump's longtime advisor Roger Stone said that Donald's father, Fred Trump, gave money to the John Birch Society. And he was a personal friend of founder Robert Welch. Fred Koch was a founding member, and multiple Koch lobbyists were in Trump's transition team. Trump's former chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, was a speaker at the National Council dinner of the John Birch Society, shortly before joining the Trump administration. U.S. Senator Rand Paul, widely reported to be one of Trump's policy advisors, is also affiliated with the John Birch Society. The senator's father, former Congressman Ron Paul, has had a long and very close relationship with the society. He celebrated the JBS in his 2008 keynote address at the Society's 50th anniversary event, saying that it led the fight to restore freedom. Right-wing conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who hosted Trump on his InfoWars radio show and claims to have a personal relationship with the president, called Trump a president of the John Birch Society and previously claimed that Trump was more John Birch Society than the John Birch Society. This explains why Trump shows such sympathy for Russia, but is tough on China. Classic conspiracy narratives were popularized in Russia after the Soviet era, and that's why right-wingers around the world think Putin is a leader in the fight against the global communist conspiracy. This explains why Alex Jones became a Putin sympathizer from 2008 onwards and became a Trump supporter in 2016. This explains why Trump and Jones consider COVID to be a fake and a left-wing conspiracy. And it explains why they believe China and the Democrats stole the 2020 presidential election. Whatever media you tune into, you will get one of very few misleading narratives based on a handful of standardized ideologies and extremely old conspiracy literature that was mainly controlled by British intelligence. You are expected to pick between the idea of a communist or fascist world conspiracy and to pick between China and Russia as your favorite international ally. The right wing now firmly believes Chinese Communist President Jinping controls Joe Biden and rigged the 2020 presidential election. The left believes that Putin controls Trump, manipulated the 2016 presidential election, and is now trying to overturn the 2020 election results. The United States is now a house thoroughly divided, and some Republicans are already talking about the secession of some states, which would result in two Americas. One would choose Russia as an ally and the other one the Chinese. Most likely there will not be an actual secession, but the ideological kind of secession in the minds of the American people has already happened, and this includes solidarity with the regimes of the East. It is precisely this international dimension which makes the situation even more dangerous.